Welcome back to the channel. This tutorial is for anyone trying to improve their voice or vocals using EQ. I do have videos detailing noise reduction and compression of vocals, but this will be a real in-depth guide to equalization, looking at which frequency ranges to treat to reduce some of the issues of recording in rooms and with microphones, and also looking at which frequencies to boost to improve the natural characteristics of the voice. So let's waste no time and get right into it. I'm using FL Studio 20, but you can use any audio editor and any EQ. This is Fruity Parametric EQ. This is the Ozone 9 EQ. They look a little bit different, but they all essentially do the same thing. To start off with this tutorial, I'm going to be using this Ozone EQ because it's really nice visual representation. And let's just listen to the first sample, which is my voice, and I want to make it sound a little bit better. As autumn takes a grip on the highlands and islands, so the wind whips up the sea, and white-crested waves come crashing down on the beaches around the coasts. I'm going to be breaking up the frequency spectrum into these different zones that we're going to sort of attack one by one in this video. The first zone we're going to attack is from 0 to 50 Hz, which is the extreme low end. Let's take a quick listen to what this sounds like. Not a whole lot of useful information, so what I'm going to do is take a high-pass filter, which is going to allow the high frequencies to pass through, and I'm going to set it probably to a 24 dB or a 12 dB per octave slope at around 50 Hz. The idea is to remove all that low-end information that isn't helping the voice, but you've got to be really careful because some people say you can push it to 100, 120, but I think there's often a lot of useful information between 50 and 100 Hz in a voice. So if I start pushing this too far, as autumn takes a grip on the highlands and islands, so the wind whips up the sea, you start hearing sort of a tinny and thin vocal, so I would recommend just starting at 50 and removing that low end because that's quite safe. It also removes sort of microphone handling noise. If someone bumps the mic stand or there's footsteps, that should get rid of all of that. The next zone we're looking at is from about 50 to 200 Hz, and we're going to try and do two things here. Remove room resonances and also see if we can bring more warmth and sort of bass to the vocal, which often sounds great. So what are room modes? Well, one of the problems with rooms is that when any sound is produced in them, either from your voice or from loudspeakers, certain frequencies will build up more than others in your room. You can listen out for these resonances with your ears, but this requires quite good headphones and also quite trained ears, to be honest. So you can go to websites such as this one. I'll leave a link in the description. You put in the dimensions of your room and it will show you which frequencies might be particularly problematic in your room. And then armed with that information, you could hunt out those particular frequencies on your EQ. Now, I just like doing this by ear. To help your ears lock in on these problems, I've prepared quite an extreme example recorded in a small room. Let's take a quick listen. This audio is recorded in a much smaller room. It sounds pretty bad, and it should be quite obvious to hear that there's a very big resonant frequency building up that I'm going to try and remove. So the first very obvious place is when I say room. Not only do you get the tone of my voice, but you hear the actual room build up this frequency. Put it in a much smaller room. Just at the end of room. Put it in a much smaller room. And I'm going to highlight where it is exactly. Put it in a much smaller room. Put it in a much smaller room. It's about 138 Hz. Put it in a much smaller room. Sounds awful, and if I then take this frequency away, let's hear a before and after. This audio is recorded in a much smaller room. This audio is recorded in a much smaller room. So it completely controls that resonance, but this room has many of them, so there's also another one, which I can hear around 200. There's a very big resonant frequency build. You can hear it right here. It sounds awful. There's a very big resonant frequency build. So I'm going to now take that one down. There's a very big resonant frequency building up. So this is a very extreme example, and you can hear just before and after. It sounds night and day different. Quite obvious to hear that there's a very big resonant. Quite obvious to hear that there's a very big resonant frequency building up. Obviously, there's a lot more to do before that vocal sounds any good, but that's sort of a worst case scenario. Let's take a listen to the original example again. If you can, try to solo a band of frequencies on your EQ. Often this can be done with Alt or the Shift key. So let's take a listen. So sometimes it just sounds, you know, like I've soloed a band, and other times you hear a big resonance, like here. So I know there's one centered at about 117, 116, something like that. If I were to take away a lot, say I were to take out 10 or 12 dB there, it's going to make my voice sound very thin and hollow. As autumn takes a grip on the highlands and islands, I lose a lot of that warmth. So I'm just looking to take away a few dB. Something like 3 or 4 dB should do it, but obviously that entirely depends on your voice. I also want to make sure that the Q is quite high because I'm only looking to affect a very narrow bandwidth, a very small range of frequencies here. I don't want a big wide thing like this that's going to take all the low end out of the vocal. A very quick note is that if you're finding you're having to make lots and lots of these cuts, it's either that your listening environment is lying to you and making you think there's problems where there aren't, or potentially your recording environment was just so bad that you should try to record maybe in a different place in your room, or maybe at a different distance from the microphone, because you shouldn't need to be making lots of big cuts like this. You should just be needing to make 1 or 2 small cuts of a few dB just to help the voice sound more natural. I also said that this 50 to 200 hertz band would be a chance to boost, to bring some warmth back into the vocal. So you can do this here, make a nice wide boost and do something like this, but I tend to like using different EQs for boosting and cutting. It can be because it sounds better, but often it's just for variety so that I don't get completely bored. So there is one that I'm liking. I like a lot of stuff from Acoustica Audio. They also make excellent free plugins, which I showed in my free plugins video. But I like centering around 1 or 200, making a quite sort of gentle bandwidth, and then boosting just a dB or 2 can just bring a little bit of warmth back into the vocal. I was also doing that boost after I did this cut, but it really doesn't matter. Just do what sounds best to you. The next zone that we're going to look at is from about 200 to about 600 or 700 hertz, and this is where we can start hunting out some either nasal frequencies or areas that sound particularly congested. I sometimes struggle with sort of sinusitis, and it means that sometimes my voice can sound particularly nasally. I think it sounds okay here, but I'm going to hone in on these frequencies for you. Let's take a listen. It's that sort of sound. So this one's a tough one. You've really got to do a lot of sort of A/B testing, turning it on and off. But I find that sometimes making a cut somewhere in this 200 to 600 range, it's entirely dependent on your voice, can just make the vocals sound so much more open, as though you had a cold and then you just take it away. And sometimes with a microphone, it's as simple as whether it was pointing up to your nose when you recorded or whether it was pointing down towards your chest. Sometimes these things make an enormous difference to the recording, and it can make your vocals sound really congested even if you didn't have a cold. So on my voice, I'm just going to make a small 2 or 3 dB cut close to 300 just to try and remedy a little bit of that. While we're still looking at this 200 to 600 zone, I want to show you that often you don't need to do much EQ work at all. I've gone to this female vocal sample, which my wife kindly spoke for us, and if we take a listen.
As dawn breaks in the Caledonian pine forests, a very different chorus echoes through these ancient trees.
Her voice is higher, so you don't have the same sort of resonant build-up at about 116 like I had, because there just wasn't much energy there, so I didn't need to cut that away at all. I would still put this sort of high-pass filter here, but there was no sort of nasality or any issue with her vocal here. Anything I remove from 200 to 600 is simply going to make her voice sound thin.
As dawn breaks in the Caledonian pine forests, a very different chorus echoes through these ancient trees.
And it might be that we just got lucky with the recording, or she just has a really, really nice voice, but don't be trying to correct problems if there are none. If you're not hearing anything wrong with it, potentially just leave it the way it is. But I'm sure you're on this tutorial because you're hearing things wrong with the recording, so let's carry on. I've gone back to the stock EQ for the next band, which is from about 600 hertz to about 4K. And this is a band that I would say almost always leave alone. There's not usually a huge a lot to gain from hunting around in this region, from my experience at least. But what you could do if you feel your voice, the microphone isn't bright enough or it sounds a little bit dark, is that you could make a really wide band like this and just make a gentle boost or cut of half a dB or so. So if I center that on around 2K, as autumn takes a grip on the highlands and islands, so the wind whips up the sea, and white-crested waves come crashing down on the beaches around the coasts. So it can take a lot of the harshness out of the voice, but I find there's not a lot to be gained from trying to hunt around and do this sort of stuff higher up. I find that it often really destroys the integrity of the voice. The next zone that we're going to look at is from about 4 to 8K. And remember that these regions are loose, they can move with your vocal, but around 4 to 8K is where we're going to look for sibilants and sort of annoying whistling frequencies. These can either come from your teeth or your voice box, or they can just come from the way the microphone interacts with the sound waves that are hitting it. You'll notice on this EQ there's quite a handy heat map that shows you build-ups of frequencies, frequency energy I should say, and around 4 to 8K you can see that there are these peaks on the S's, the sibilant words here. And what I'm trying to do is just hone in on these a little bit and reduce them. They sound like this. Don't listen too loud. So the wind whips up the sea. So the wind whips up the sea. So the wind whips up the sea. So you can see on my voice I found one at 8.5K. So these ranges are quite loose. You just, adapt them to your own voice. So if I make a small cut at around 8.5 and I heard another one around here. So the wind whips up the sea. Around 5K or so. If I just make two small cuts like this. So the wind whips up the sea. I mean, to my ears, that is just so much smoother. There is an effects processor called a de-esser, which listens out for these sibilant frequencies or harsh whistly sounds, and it reduces them for you automatically. Now, if you have one of those plugins and you want to experiment with it, I do have a tutorial showing you how to set that up. But I find for, at least 80 or 90% of tasks, just a little EQ cut like this really just smooths it all out, and it's all you really need. A quick word of warning though, you don't want to be doing too much cutting here because otherwise it completely ruins the intelligibility of your speech. Take a listen. Any summer holiday makers are by now long gone and the beaches are deserted. So it sounds very smooth, but over time that's going to start sounding like a problem. My voice no longer sounds like me. The next zone is from about 8 kilohertz and up, and this is an area that people can often define as like a vocal air frequency or just that shimmery or silky top end. In my experience, after testing dozens and dozens of these more affordable and pretty good microphones, whether XLR or USB, and recording in normal rooms of all shapes and sizes, not just this treated room I'm in right now, I find that boosting anything in that extreme top end always just sounds sizzly and harsh, or maybe not always, but 95% of the time. And I think often we boost it because we've been listening to it for like 5-10 minutes, editing it, and then we boost it and it sounds different and it's exciting, so we keep it. But I mean, I've heard a lot of podcasts which just sound really sizzly in the top, a lot of vocals which are just too bright, in my opinion, and I would say just leave that alone up the top unless you've taken a good break, you've come back to it and you've really decided, you know what, this vocal is too dark, it's too muted, it could do with a dB or two on the top. I'm going to wrap this up with a quick recap. We're looking from about 0 to 50 hertz just to cut off those lowest rumbly frequencies to stop footsteps, microphone taps, stuff like that. Then from around 50 to 200, we're looking for those room resonances. Then from around 200 to maybe 600 or 700, we're looking for any sort of congestion or nasality in the vocal if you don't want it to be there, if it doesn't sound natural. And then between about 600 hertz and 4 or 5K, I would leave that alone or make a very wide, very subtle boost just to smooth things out or make things a little bit brighter. Then I'd hunt for sibilant frequencies between about maybe 4 and 8 or 9K, and then I'd probably leave the extreme top end alone because it can tend to sound really sizzly, but if you want a little bit of brightness, feel free to add some there. Once you've done all the cuts away, I would also recommend adding a little bit more of that warmth to the bottom end. Just a dB or so can just make listening to the voice so much more bearable, nice and warm and thick. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope it was helpful, and I hope to see you in the next video too. Bye for now.